I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation which is based very much on the post-revolution thinking, with a focus on moving on the front of social justice. So I'll take you through first my justification for focusing on the south of Egypt, rural, especially Upper Egypt, and look in some detail at what can be done with a vision for growth, development, and increased equality between the south and the north. I'm going to go very quickly through the first two demands of the youth of the revolution, freedom and dignity, and I'll focus much more on the social justice, and then on my own vision for how to tackle both poverty and inequality. The answer is very much in targeting. What kind of targeting are we talking about? Who, on behalf of whom? The need for decentralization is an essential part of that new vision. And then about ENID itself, which I've been directing for a year and a half now. And finally look at some of the conclusions on why policy matters. Well, pre-revolution of January 2011, we can say that Egypt was very short of all kinds of freedoms: freedom of assembly, freedom of association, information, access, the press, the media, freedom of expression, independence of the judiciary, and due process in civilian courts. And all of these, of course, have frustrated a lot Egyptian people, and I think the peak of our frustration came in the summer of 2010, when the elections for parliament were totally played around with by the Mubarak regime. In terms of dignity, we're talking very much about youth. Why? Because they have suffered the most, and they perhaps are the most excluded community in Egypt in terms of employment. Previous to, let's say, 30 years ago, which is, we're looking at youth under 30 years of age, jobs were very much available through the government employment policy and the public enterprise sector. And the work environment was very much controlled, but with a very positive approach to the very populist approach to making jobs available, even if they had very low productivity. So if we think of unemployment that reached perhaps 12% at around that time, 2010, and that 90% of the unemployed were and remain under 30 years of age, then you can imagine the kind of frustration that youth have. Additionally, we have very serious problems with gender integration and equality. And I understand that Ragi Azad gave you a talk about labor markets. Not only do women have a very low participation rate in the labor market, about only 22% of women in Egypt who are of working age are actually working or seeking employment, but we also find that they get the lower end of jobs. So their main job is in agriculture, and the second area is with the public or civil service, as teachers especially, and in the health system. But worse still is the discrimination amongst regions. So you find that the good jobs, like government jobs, which has total security and pensions and health insurance, etc., the bulk of the jobs are in the urban areas and in the north. So the result of all this is that women in southern Egypt, and especially rural Egypt, their participation is as low as 6% of the age working women, that is 15 and above. At 6%, including agriculture, you can imagine how the culture and the tradition works against women's employment. Also, of course, all of the corruption that we read about and much more has been a major cause of frustration, and we were happy to see the revolution and its main architects, the youth, so that what they asked for, which is the dignity and freedom and social justice, even though they came from the middle class, they were not a very large or very representative group, but there was enormous response from all citizens. So when we talk about social justice, what do we mean here? We know that not only do we have very high levels of poverty in Egypt. Our poverty line is $2.50 per day at purchasing power parity. Those below the poverty line have increased from about 20% just a few years ago to, at the moment, 25%. And that's a huge increase. We're talking of millions and millions of people who've fallen under the poverty line in a country where you have some 84 million inhabitants. Those who are the most vulnerable, as I said, are the unemployed youth, women-headed households, landless farmers, informal sector employees, especially those who are in the irregular type of jobs, like daily workers in agriculture, because a lot of the time, seasonally, they are unemployed, and especially in the south, we talk of seasons like, for instance, sugarcane is the main crop in the south, and it's a perennial crop. You don't have to work with it except a few months when you are collecting the crop for the sugar factory. The subsidizing in Egypt has also been extremely unjust, if you like, in terms of who it is that gets the subsidies. We're talking of food subsidies of about 2% of our total GDP. And food subsidies we find through the ration card, you have an exclusion of about 16% of those who are below the poverty line, and you have something like 70% of those who are non-poor getting the subsidy. Same thing with bread, which is supposedly available everywhere in Egypt at a very highly subsidized price. You'll find that in the south, in a lot of communities and villages, it's not available, so people are not accessing the subsidy. And the most atrocious of all subsidies is the fuel subsidy, which eats up something like 6% of our GDP, which is more than total expenditure of the government on education and health. And these tremendous burdens on the budget have not yet been tackled. There's debate and debate and debate ever since the first few months of the revolution back in 2011, but not much was done about it. In terms of minimum and maximum wage in the public sector, we finally arrived on a minimum wage which has been set at 1,200 Egyptian pounds in principle, and which should be operational from January 2014, and yet the government does not want to accept a maximum wage in the government and public sector, even though we have some outrageous salaries in all kinds of places, like the banks that are public sector, or in the media sector and others. But most of all, what we're all agreed on, I mean, everybody in Egypt is aware now of all these problems, and the last one being that the urban regions have been favored at the expense of rural Egypt. Even during the Nasser era, after the 52 revolution, you'll find that you have many pieces of evidence on this bias. For instance, just taking the expenditure on education, at one point in time in the 70s and 80s, university education was swallowing up something like 40% of the education budget, even though, of course, it caters for a very small proportion of those who are lucky enough to get it. This is the cover page of our Human Development Report for 2010, which Djavad was telling you got a prize or an award for excellence. And it came out in mid-2010. If you see the bubble here, this young lady saying, "I'm proud I'm Egyptian, but how should I show it?" And sure enough, a few months later, we had the revolution. In that report, where we had 8 out of 30-some authors were young people, some of whom were in the revolution a few months later, we had 9, the biggest number of messages that were insisted on the education problem. Sorry. So the first was the education system failure. And here let me just tell you that, again, if we look at the 2 most serious problems with education, one is the level of the level of disparity between those who get an advanced or university education and those who don't. And we had, for that report, we were lucky enough to get a huge survey of youth under 30 years of age, and it was shocking to see that more than half of the top quintile, or the top 20% of society, youth had a university education, and in the poorest quintile, it was like 4% who had access to university education. The failure is that, the huge gap between the output or supply of educated youth and the demand for them in the job market, and the lack of interest of youth in going into vocational training. Egypt has 2 paths when you're 16 in school. Either you go into the path that leads to university, if you have very good grades, or you end up in vocational and technical education, which no young person wants. And this is one of the huge problems, because these are the real jobs. We can't all be white-collar workers, white-collar employees. And this is what we're trying to deal with in the South, because the South has much less of these problems with the kind of graduation and qualifications to get. Breaking the cycle of poverty, here again we were thinking about the very many ways in which we can create ways to get round the problems of poverty, especially with social safety nets of all kinds, and cash transfers and conditional cash transfers and asset transfer and the like. Job creation, which I've mentioned. The focus on culture. It was very obvious since 2010 that there was a regression in the values of youth and their their temperament and their attitude towards the other. The level of animosity between religions, the attitude to women, everything was really going very badly. On gender discrimination, this is a much longer and older problem, which I think Egypt is maybe a little better off than a lot of other Arab countries or countries in the Middle East, but definitely very much at the bottom of the ranking. Egypt's rank on the gender indicators of well-being is something like 120 out of 128 countries. Only Yemen and Saudi Arabia fare worse than Egypt. Youth well-being was also very important, and we'll look later at some of our criteria for well-being. There's something like 9 dimensions of deprivation and multidimensional areas of deprivation. Here we had a lot of recommendations on how to enhance youth participation. In this huge survey, which is called SAIP, the Survey of Youth in Egypt, we found that of young people in Egypt, we found that something like only 4% of youth were engaged in any kind of political activity, and less than 20% were engaged in the in elections. Migration seems like a very good policy for Egypt, since you have such an oversupply of young graduates especially. And we also asked for the government to engage in negotiations, and we have best practices like countries like Italy, in fact, which has special programs for young people in the vocational training from Egypt to meet with the demands of their market in Italy. The final message, which to me was the most important one, was the asset constraint. Egypt has, as you all know, only 5% of its land is utilized, and the idea here was to redistribute land, not agricultural land, but land for small businesses. Nothing's happened on that front, but it is still a very important option for redistribution. Sorry?
Could you elaborate on the housing issue on the urban sector? How many salaries does it take to buy an apartment?
It's very difficult, but here what we were considering that it could be for either housing or for any business opportunity. In Egypt you have a considerable proportion of young people who've moved to entrepreneurship, and yet they're very short of capital. So if you give them at least the land on condition that they will use it productively, they only need a few meters, in fact, compared to land distribution when you talk of agricultural land. So, and there is one region which is only in the south. It borders on the valley. You have on both sides of the Nile a very narrow strip of green land, and then you have on the west side, the western desert, you have about 1 million fedans or acres to be reclaimed, plus to be used for housing, etc., and irrigated from what's called the Nubian aquifer. This just shows you that in 2007 we had Egypt's first poverty map. Egypt has about 4,500 villages. The 1,000 poorest, 94.1%, 941 are in those 6 governorates of Giza. Giza has very few, of course, because it's quite rich, and Beni Suef only 13. But then you get into Menia, Asyut, Sohag, Kena, Aswan, and that gives you 10 million people living in these villages, half of whom are below the poverty line, way below the poverty line, with an average which is below actually the extreme poverty line, which is something like $1.50 per day. This again shows you the density of poverty in the south. Here is all of Egypt, and we're just talking about this little square here, which gives us the distance from Luxor up to Asyut. And this is where you have the highest concentration of food poverty. Very high is dark brown, and yellow or white is very low. So you can see that all of the north of Egypt is reasonably well off when compared to the south. Here again you see what happened between just the 2 years, 2009, just before the revolution, and 2011, just after, because this is when a big survey is conducted. It was conducted every 2 years, and it shows you the blue bar is 2011. It shows you the increase in the percentage of the population. These are percentages. So in Asyut, poverty increase and food access deteriorated by all of that much, from 55% to 65%. The same with Sohag, Qena, Luxor. The only delta governorate where you had a deterioration is Qalyubayya, which is in Greater Cairo. And this again is just the justification, okay? So I feel very confident that if we want to fight poverty and improve income and the distribution of public goods and services in Egypt, we have to target the south, okay? Of course, we have a very high fiscal deficit, and it's not easy right now, but we know that one answer is the private sector, which already now, since the 70s, has grown enough to become responsible for 2/3 of growth in Egypt. And one of the areas which has done very poorly relative to others is manufacturing, which is very labor intensive and could create a lot of jobs, especially if we adopt a vision where we move a lot of industries to the south, where wages are half those in the north. So the need for structural reform of the economy is to promote also agro-industry, because that's the mainstay of the economies in the south, enhancing public sector quality and efficiency in all of the utilities and the services, especially education and health, and to promote investment in the south. And we've done an investment map for Qena, which is the governorate that we're focusing on, and found that there are a lot of opportunities. Now, overall, Egypt is still exporting less than 10% of its manufacturing output, which means, since it's doing so poorly, that it can increase by leaps and bounds, okay? And the vision is for labor-intensive manufacturing to migrate to the south. Also in the south, you have huge opportunities for forward integration, that is moving up the value chain from those few industries we have: cotton spinning, sugar factories, pulp and paper, building materials, and we have a huge aluminium smelter in Nag Hammadi, which is also in Qena, and we need to improve and renovate our vocational training centers. What's missing is very much innovative design, and this is what we've started with our new initiative, which started, as I said, very much as a product of the revolution in 2011. I was part of the group that was working on the social dialogue, the national dialogue on the social front, one of the 5 pillars we were trying to resolve what to move on. And there's a young lady here, Professor and Dr. Sahar Tohemi, who was working with me at the Egypt Network for Integrated Development, and that these are the objectives of ENID. First, it's to have an integrated development that encompasses growth, employment, and income generation for the benefit of communities in Upper Egypt. And the methodology is action-oriented. It's also research-oriented, because what we're doing is finding what are existing best practices and actually designing best practices which can then be scalable. And scalability is the name of the game, because if you do one fishery, okay, in the south that is economically viable and profitable, then you'll have a lot of young people and maybe older people who would come and do the same. And what we're doing is available as best practice for teaching and giving all of the information on. So we have also business models are terribly important. We've looked at cluster promotion, especially in China, and how they do it from the level of a village. One village, one product, which is a Japanese model. Asset transfer, and there's a lot of that in Africa and in Bangladesh and other very poor situations and villages. The idea of asset transfer is to go beyond just helping with education and training and so on, and to actually give some capital to poor women or young people who can then be taught and trained to use this capital and to give them the chance to have sustainability. We're also very, very interested, if we are successful within 5 years, because it's a 5-year project, the whole ENID project, then we'll be able to franchise some 45 products which we're introducing. Products meaning not just goods like agricultural products or manufactured products, but also a lot of services which we're working with. And in fact, Sahar was working on the biggest one in services, which is to make a model system for sanitation. And over 80% of villages in the south do not have any system of sanitation. Design is of the essence, because you need to differentiate and have more variety of products. Training is very important, and we now have 5 training centers, which are Tibet schools, which we are revamping and training teachers and introducing new curricula. And we've even taken permission from the Ministry of Education to, in fact, sell the products of these schools so that they can buy the raw materials they need for training. Marketing is very difficult and challenging, but we're working on it, and access to microcredits. And that's more or less the sequence. First, you have to think of a market and the product, and then what specific training you need, and how to market and where, and then the access to credit. 1 or 2 best practice pilots per project are what we hope for, and they will be relevant not just for Egypt, but for other countries in Africa and the Middle East. Our criteria for intervention are to have innovative products and improved technology. Why? Because the problem with most NGOs in Egypt is they all help their beneficiaries compete with the same products. And so the market is oversaturated and the supply is excessive and everybody fails. So what we're doing is insisting that we want to do different things, and we want to do them in a very up-to-date technological way. We find there are huge opportunities for import substitution as well as export orientation and productivity enhancement. And we're also improving management and leadership skills. And as I mentioned earlier, our biggest opportunity is to use the desert fringe in Upper Egypt. Not only does it have a lot of mining opportunities, but it's mainly to allow the highly congested inhabited area and cultivated area for people to move to the western desert, to the left, rather than go up to the greater Cairo region. These are just some of the products we have on the left-hand side, what we call our high-end products, like the fisheries, the Ecolodge, the sanitation. A big one is ready-made garments. We have started to build, in fact, inside one of our Tibet schools, the secondary schools, which has 5 acres. It's a girls' school in a village, one of 20 such schools in all of the governorate, a ready-made garments factory that exports, and it has the technology and the training and the market from some of Egypt's biggest business people who are working in export of garments. Now, if this works, if one factory works, then we hope that this can be scaled up to several hundred or even 1,000 such factories. We're working with new solar energy systems for pulling water from as I said, the aquifer, the Nubian aquifer, which is just adjacent to the cultivated land, biogas, a lot of niche handicrafts. Here is where we're talking about going into creating or developing existing clusters, because you know that where we're working in the south of Egypt used to be the capital of Egypt, Thebes. Okay, Qena is part with Luxor together of the ancient capital of Egypt, and there are still existing handicrafts. So we're trying to save the last looms, hand weaving looms and that kind of thing. Here we've done a lot of comparative advantage analysis to include all of these new kinds of agricultural products. And so it goes. So to go back to the policy relevance, how many minutes do I have? 10 more? That's very good. What we found is that there's a huge opportunity in tourism, because the region, and I'm sure a lot of you know Egypt, is full of sites, not just the temples and ancient Egyptian monuments, but we're talking also about very old monasteries and Sufi shrines and mosques. We have desert agriculture, which is especially organic. As I said, handicrafts. We're training our young people in over 12 different handicrafts, and we have a specialist who's doing a market study in the Gulf and in Mecca to export all kinds of handicrafts which don't exist at the moment. We have most of our handicrafts for even the tourist market come from China. And as I said, you need to go through the trouble of exploring the raw materials and using good taste and having new designs and marketing and training. All of this is happening very successfully, and it doesn't take very long. On average, it takes about 6 months, and we've converted a lot of these handicrafts, which used to be totally predominantly the men's work in Cairo. We've moved them to Upper Egypt, and it's girls who are doing that work, and they love it. A lot of it are very old crafts which we are reviving. In terms of the constraints we have, and that's where our links with the government are terribly important. For instance, we need more infrastructure in terms of transport. We have the vocational training facilities. We don't have sufficient funds, but we already want to move into the commercial schools, which are also in very bad shape, the secondary schools. The access to the Zahir Sahrawi or the hinterland, and business development services. We have an entire program for youth centers, because this is where politically, you've had a lot of encroachment from the Muslim Brotherhood, and we think we can do much better in terms of giving them the skills. Every village in Egypt, over 4,500 villages, have a youth center. So we are renovating them completely from just having a football pitch to becoming girl-friendly in the daytime, where girls only are allowed to take programs in literacy, language, computer, IT skills, entrepreneurship classes, and they're extremely popular, cultural programs, because that's one way, that you have a lot of Christians in the South, and they have really been excluded from youth centers, so we're trying to reintegrate them into these programs. And women's empowerment. We're also working a lot as far as women are concerned with the handicraft skills and with the NGOs. The NGOs are the only delivery mechanism that we believe is there for sustainability. ENID will not be there in 5 years' time, but we hope that these NGOs we are training, there's upwards of 500 NGOs in that governorate of Qina, but maybe 20% or so are really successful. So we need to raise the standards. Asset transfer has already been provided in some areas, but they're also going to be available, such as sewing machinery, dairy equipment, vegetable drying equipment, and all kinds of storage facilities for communal and cooperative work. These are the kinds of skills we're teaching, not just spinning and weaving or ready-made garments, but there's engineering, construction. We're also thinking some of our villages are devoid of any men because they've all migrated to make a living either in Libya or in the Gulf. So we find it's an opportunity to at least train them before they travel so they can get better incomes and better pay. And our partners are everywhere, from master craftsmen. You know that Egypt for the first time now has a union of craftspeople in Egypt, and we're talking of thousands and thousands of craftspeople. It also has its first union of agricultural workers, and we're helping them have more voice and more access to the government. That's our Ecolodge, the first totally eco-friendly lodge for 20 with 20 rooms. It's been designed so as to use only local raw materials, and I hope we can invite you sometime next year to visit us in Dandara, which has this beautiful temple in Qina. And my last slide is just to recapitulate where it is that the government and policy making can make a huge difference. First, in education and vocational training, in bringing research, which is what we're doing. We're working with upwards of 10 research centers, for instance, that are linked to the Ministry of Agriculture, with our agricultural team of something like 15 people working on the ground with research backgrounds. Also working with universities in the South. You have something like 5 big universities in the South, and it's terribly important to involve them, to be involved with the training at the vocational training centers in the summer, and to create to give better training themselves, especially in the area of entrepreneurship. We're also working, and it's important to bring different stakeholders. So almost every project we've started has the approval of the local stakeholders, who are the community participating, plus the local government people. ICT is great, has a great future. Even pharmaceuticals That's my background when I did my PhD. So we found that we can produce a lot of pharmaceutical products from what is grown in the south for the local and foreign markets. Food processing is also very labor intensive. Accreditation is missing in Egypt. Our Faculty of Economics at Cairo University is the first one in the entire Egyptian context to get accredited internationally. Patents will be important. And finally, as I said, franchising. If we get to the situation in our final year where we have franchised some of these 45 products, then I shall be very happy. Okay.
Thank you.
Pleasure.